So as I've already been introduced, my name's Bron. I'm doing my PhD on the red and green kangaroo paw. Start off by acknowledging that my PhD work was funded by an Australian Research Council grant and by the Holsworth Wildlife Research Endowment Fund. I wanted to start off today by talking about kangaroo paws and cat's paws in general, because I think sometimes the red and green one gets all the love, and these guys are pretty amazing as well. They're so unusual looking that they actually ended up in Star Wars. So I don't know if anyone's seen The Force Awakens, but at the very beginning there's some hybrid Enigaxanthus. I think I'm probably one of the only people in the world who noticed they were there, but I was really excited when they popped up in the cinema. We talk about kangaroo paws and cat's paws. As far as I know, no one's entirely certain about where the names came from. But in general, kangaroo paws are probably named after the red and green one on your left, and most kangaroo paw species have their perianth curved back, which is just a fancy way of saying the flower curls up on top of the anthers, while cat's paws are splayed out like that. They're probably named after these two species, so the red and green kangaroo paw and the common cat's paw, as those were the ones that were around in Perth. But obviously there's a lot more diversity than just these two little guys, so if you give me 5 minutes, I just want to quickly go through all of the local kangaroo paws and cat's paws. So this one is Enigaxanthus flavidus, also known as the red kangaroo paw. I'm sure you've seen this one. It's incredibly popular in garden beds and grows to a couple of metres tall. It's sometimes called the evergreen kangaroo paw because it doesn't get those horrible black rusty ink spots that most of the other species get, so it's really popular in gardens. We're skipping ahead. This is the smallest kangaroo paw, the little kangaroo paw, or Enigaxanthus bicolour. It's really closely related to this guy, which is Enigaxanthus gabrielii, or the dwarf kangaroo paw. I've been told that the difference is that these guys have slightly narrower flowers, but I've never seen it myself, but I'm trusting the experts. Hopefully you've seen this guy around. He's near Perth, Enigaxanthus viridis, and I love the green coloured flowers in this one. Well, this one is Enigaxanthus pulcharimus, or the yellow kangaroo paw. This is the only kangaroo paw that we have evidence of mammal pollination in, so we know that honey possums can visit these flowers. There's Enigaxanthus rufus, which has absolutely stunning flowers as well that you won't see around here, but you will down south. And if we look at the cat's paws, there's obviously Enigaxanthus humilis. This is the branched cat's paw, which is the only one I know of that produces these little branches. It's really tiny as well. It's about 30 centimetres high normally, but they still manage to produce all of these flowers. There's the cowberry cat's paw, which I haven't actually managed to find yet in the wild. And then this is my favourite cat's paw. So this is Enigaxanthus prezii, and I absolutely love the flowers with the weird shape that they have and the colours as well. It reminds me an awful lot of what we like to call the 12th kangaroo paw, which is the black and green kangaroo paw. This guy is all by himself in a genus by his lonesome. He's closely related to Enigaxanthus, but isn't quite the same. But most of the kangaroo paws and cat's paws you'll see around are actually hybrid species. So the panel in the middle is from the Bush Gems collection. I think at the moment there's 25 different hybrids they sell commercially, while this guy on the left is actually Kings Park Federation Flame, and this one is Kings Park Anniversary Gold, I think they call it. And these ones are actually bred in Kings Park. So there's a really amazing team of plant breeders at Kings Park who create these incredible hybrids to sell in the gardens. And I promised I'd say a plug while I was here, which is that this weekend there's a Friends of Kings Park plant sale, so you can come along and buy these kangaroo paws. And the Friends of Kings Park, as well as supporting the park in general, they also put a lot of money into supporting student projects in science at the park, so I'm a little bit biased, but I really like them because they've given me some money. They're obviously very common in gardens because of their beautiful, amazing looks, but they're also really popular because of what pollinates them. So you guys have probably noticed, not everyone does, that this bird is a little bit ruffled. He's a spinebill. This is actually one that we caught for banding, which is why he doesn't look super happy. But you can see on his forehead, when he's been visiting a flower, the pollen that gets deposited on there. While bird pollination is really important in Australia, it also happens in all over the world. So worldwide we have about 900 species of birds that visit flowers. There's 300 mammals, including this little guy is not an Australian species, this is a South African one, but I think he's gorgeous. He's an elephant shrew, but also rats, bats as well like to visit flowers. And even occasionally you get lizards. So this again is not an Australian species, this is from Hawaii, I believe, but worldwide around 40 species of lizard will visit flowers. It's generally considered to be something that only happens on islands, but we recently, well not we personally, but they recently discovered in South Africa that lizards are visiting flowers over there, so it really wouldn't surprise me if it's also happening here in the southwest as well. Bird and mammal pollination, however, is incredibly important in the southwest. You probably know this, but we have our own floristic region here, so from Kalbarri up in the north right down to Esperance is its own unique floral region, and in that floral region 15% of our plants are pollinated by birds and mammals. This is actually the highest percentage in the world. Worldwide the average is around 4%. In Europe there's one bird pollinated species, which means it's less than 0.01% of their plants are pollinated by birds and mammals. And when I was at a conference in Germany last year, they told me that bird and mammal pollination wasn't important, which upset me a little bit because it's obviously incredibly important here in Australia. The main pollinators we have here are obviously our incredible range of honey eaters from the western spinebills and the red wattlebirds, but we also have mammal pollinators as well. So this guy, hopefully you know, is a western pygmy possum, and then across in the other corner who's a little bit cut off, that's my favourite animal of all, which is the honey possum. We're not really sure why bird and mammal pollination is so common here in the southwest. In general, worldwide, we know that bird pollination is more common in the southern hemisphere and in ocbils, which are old climatically buffered infertile landscapes. The southwest is a perfect example of an ocbil because our region didn't have any glacier action in the last ice age, so our soils are really, really old, and really old soils seem to promote bird pollination. Australia also has a lot of bird pollinators, so the map on the side, which unfortunately is a little bit cut off, but you'll see that we have honey eaters, we also have lorikeets, and in Queensland we also get some of the sunbird family as well. In general, bird pollinated plants are red coloured, but that is very much not always. They produce abundant amounts of dilute nectar, they don't have a scent. In Australia in particular, perches seem to be important because our birds aren't like hummingbirds, they won't hover very often at flowers, they like to land to feed. And the flowers can be anything from hanging flowers to brush flowers to curved long flowers or even long tubular flowers. I'm going to be talking mainly today about bird pollinators, but I did want to talk briefly about this little guy because these, as I said, are my favourite animals. This is a honey possum. They weigh about 10 grams, will fit in the palm of your hand. They don't have any teeth, which is really important when you're trapping animals because they can't bite you, so I enjoy that a lot. And they feed solely on pollen and nectar, and as far as I know, they're the only mammal in the world whose diet consists just of pollen and nectar. Someone once worked out that they need to drink the equivalent of you and I having 40 litres of lemonade every single day in order to get their nutritional requirements, which means that they're really, really effective pollinators because they spend an awful lot of time feeding on flowers. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a field site that had these guys in them and also had red and green kangaroo paws, but my supervisor, Ziggy Kraus, up at Kings Park, is working with Banksia, and these is a little camera trap footage of a little honey eater feeding on Banksia flowers. This is up in Eneabba, so a couple of hours away. Yeah, unfortunately, as far as I know, there's no honey possums left in the Perth area. They used to be really widespread, but they're disappearing. Yanchip as well?
We've got heaps of that.
Ah, yes. I need to go. While we're very lucky to have amazing animals like this, there's also some worrying news, which is that in the southwest, as I said, 15% of our plants are bird and mammal pollinated, but unfortunately 40% of our threatened plants rely on invertebrates. We don't know why bird and mammal pollinated plants have a higher chance of being threatened, but that's where my research group at Kings Park comes in. We're interested in understanding the really complicated relationships between birds and the plants they visit, because if we understand what's going on, maybe we can help protect them and keep them in our landscape to continue. My PhD is obviously focusing on these guys, the red and green kangaroo paw, and I'm working with scientists from UWA and Kings Park as well as someone from over at ANU. Hopefully these guys don't need much of an introduction in this room. They're our state floral emblem. They're an amazing plant. They flower everywhere from Carberry in the north down to Albany in the south. You can see on the map that there's a little bit of a gap here. The northern subspecies, which is quadrants, they have branched flowers, so they'll have multiple flowering heads on a stem, while the species you see around here should have a single flowering head. That's not always the case, particularly if you go to Kings Park and look at the areas near the Botanic Gardens, but I think there might be some contamination between plants in the Botanic Gardens spilling over into the bushland there. Their flowers are pretty amazing. They're highly exaggerated. They produce these 6 long anthers at the front. Each anther has about 50,000 pollen grains on them. I counted. I don't recommend it. And so each flower produces around 300,000 pollen grains, and there can be up to 20 flowers per plant. So they're pumping a lot of pollen out into the system. While the red and green colour form is the most common, they also show up in other colours. So this is my favourite. They're purple and red. This shot was actually taken off Canning Mills Road up in the Perth Hills, and I also found some ones out there that were sort of hybrid between the purple and the green, so they were patchy. They were really beautiful. They flower this time of year, so between August right up until November sometimes. You'll see them flowering in the bushland. In October they hopefully have all started forming fruits, but those fruits and seeds aren't ready until late December, early January, where they crack open and fall out into the surroundings. I think I've had a few kangaroo paws that I was following where the flowering head has disappeared suddenly in the bush once it forms seeds. So there's potentially maybe some parrots or something else is coming along and munching on the seeds, but I haven't been able to get a photo of what's going on there yet. One thing that's important to note about these guys is that all of the flowers don't appear at once. They flower in a staggered fashion. Generally, you'll see 2 flowers open at any given time. The immature flowers are curled up. They'll open up like these ones up here, and then once they close, they fall out to the side. And this seems to be important for bird pollination because it essentially creates a runway or a landing patch for the bird to land on, and so that the flower always fits perfectly on its head. Interestingly enough, to me at least, is that the flowers that come up first, so form fruit first, actually have more seeds per fruit than the fruits that form later. So you'll get about 120 seeds per fruit in the bottom flowers, while the higher up ones you only get around 100 seeds per fruit. It might be that the plant is investing a lot of resources into the first ones that appear, or there are some species where they think that the plant switches its focus partway through flowering. So at the beginning it's focusing as much as it can on producing seeds, and then later on in its flowering period it starts to focus on producing pollen. So it's switching from caring about being a mother to caring about being a father partway through the flowering season. I really want to test that in kangaroo paws, but I haven't managed to do it just yet. Obviously the most special thing about these guys is their pollination. So this is a little brown honeyeater, and he's getting nectar from the base of the flower here. Hopefully you can see the anthers here, which are bright yellow, which will be rubbing the pollen onto his back. And the really important area is just next to the anthers, which is the stigma or the female reproductive area of the plant. So these guys are probably the perfect example of a bird pollinated species, but they're not only visited by birds. And the first and most basic question of my PhD was simply what animals feed on kangaroo paws. So I went out in Kings Park and up in Kurrung National Park in the Perth Hills and spent a couple of 100 hours watching all the visitors coming to the flowers. Got some little guys like ants that would come in and feed on nectar. We don't think they're actually pollinating the flower because they spend most of their time getting nectar. And ants themselves often secrete sort of chemical properties that basically kill the pollen if it landed on their body. There's also some bush crickets coming in, and these guys seem to like feeding on the flowers. You can see I was watching him chew holes in my flowers. They seem to prefer to eat the pollen grains either when they're immature or when they're open as well. And I saw an awful lot of these guys. So this is the European honeybee. They seem to visit kangaroo paw flowers at least 4 times every hour, particularly in the early morning, and They spent most of the time gathering pollen, though occasionally they'd crawl into the base of the flower to get nectar. But most of the time they spent gathering pollen. And they're really effective at getting the pollen. They would essentially strip 99% of the pollen off of the anthers while they were foraging. My main reason I was out there was I was looking for birds, but as well as doing that in person, I also put out camera traps, which means I got a series of photos like this. So these camera traps take a photo every second when they're triggered by motion, and you get these amazing little time-lapse videos here. If you look really closely, it might not be clear to the back of the room. There's a little brown honeyeater that's hanging out on the cage in the background as well. But this is a really good example of how well adapted these flowers are for bird pollination, because they go up to feed and just get bumped on the head by the pollen at the back. Not all the time though bird pollinators are being successful. So this is a little silver eye, and they don't feed properly on the flowers. They instead create slits in the base of the flower. So he's going up, he yanks down the flower and then creates a hole and then drinks the nectar. I don't know why they do this. It seems like a lot more effort than just drinking from the flower like all the other birds, but they're pretty common in Kings Park. And I've even seen bees drinking from the slits that the silver eyes created as well. But what was really surprising to me was how infrequent bird pollination was. So in my first field season, I sat outside for 50 hours and wandered around as well in Kings Park, and I didn't see a single bird visit a single flower. And then the year after that, I saw 3 visitation events. This is obviously very different to what we see in garden beds or in burnt patches. I was sitting at the cafe in Kings Park telling my supervisors that there were no birds visiting the flowers while there were birds behind me pollinating all the kangaroo paws in the garden. So I was really glad when the camera traps sort of validated what I was seeing, which was that in Kings Park, we only got 1 bird visit to a plant each week, which is incredibly low. Previous work done by one of my supervisors, Steve Hopper, found multiple visits in an hour, but he was working up at the Gingin Cemetery, which is an area that used to get slashed and burnt an awful lot, so the flowers are in a really high density. So I think the density of kangaroo paws is important for visitation rates. When the birds were there, they did a good job. They visited every flower in the patch. They would visit every flower open, and they would make sure that they pretty much hopped from nearest flower to nearest flower. But just because a pollinator is visiting a plant doesn't mean it's actually pollinating. We might not always get fruit and seed set because we need them to touch that all-important stigma there, the female reproductive area. So I went through all of my videos of bees and all of my camera trap footage and added up all of the times that they contacted the stigma, the female part, and bees, they're only contacting the female area around 13% of the time, while birds, it was around 45% of the time. So from this, we can theorise that bees are not as an effective pollinator as the birds, and they're probably acting mainly as thieves. They're going in and they're stealing predominantly pollen, but occasionally nectar as well. But I saw this and I was like, yes, birds are a much more effective pollinator, but if I looked at my visitation rates, the birds were only visiting once a week while the bees were visiting multiple times in a day. So I was like, well, if a bee is visiting multiple times in a day, maybe it doesn't matter that it has such a low contact rate with the stigma. So I wanted to know how critical birds pollinators were for the red and green kangaroo paw, which meant I ran something called an exclusion experiment. These are pretty common in pollination biology. We essentially put cages or bags around flowers to manipulate what gets access to those flowers. So in this case, I did total exclusion, which meant that it was a 1 millimeter netting, sort of like a fly net around the flowers, so only self-pollination could occur. I had chicken wire that I put around them so that only insects could get in, and you can see a little honeybee in here visiting one of my flowers. And then I had open plants that both bird and insects could visit. We currently don't have a great way of allowing birds access to flowers but excluding insects. Some people have tried using insecticides, but that seems to also deter the birds a lot from the area as well. Some people in America run experiments where they'll sit out in the bush with a bag over a flower, take it off and wait for a pollinator to visit and then put a bag back on. And I would have loved to have done that, but when they only come once a week, it was going to be a really long experiment and probably a waste of my time. So I set these cages up in 4 populations, 2 in Kings Park and 2 up in the Perth Hills. I waited until summer and I went back and I collected the seeds and the fruits from the plants. And what I found, and apologies for this scientific looking graph, is that bird pollination is really important. So these blue box plots with the red square being the average number of fruits is for the open flowers. So flowers that were open, that birds and insects were both visiting, produced many more fruits than those that the birds couldn't visit. But there is a really big range, which could be both a combination of the birds not visiting very often, because some of these plants had 0 fruit set in my sites, while others had almost 100%. So maybe that was a plant a bird doesn't visit at all in the area. If we look at seeds, it's a very similar story. The most seeds I found in a fruit, and I unfortunately had to count these all by hand, is incredibly important for these kangaroo paws. We talk about the population potentially being pollen limiting though, because there are so many fruits and so many seeds that could have been produced that aren't getting produced in these sites. I'm not super worried about the long-term health of these populations though, because in total, I think I counted up 120,000 seeds. So there is definitely still pumping an awful lot of seeds into the system, which is good. But essentially, as far as I can tell, bird pollination is critical for the red and green kangaroo paw, and the European honeybee cannot effectively replace birds as pollinators. But my background's in genetics, so I had to take this one step further. So I wanted to know if there were any genetic consequences of pollination by this introduced honeybee. So I went out and collected the seeds and germinated them. And if you ever want to grow your own kangaroo paw seeds that you've got from your own property and not national parks, you just need to collect the fruits just before they open. You store them for at least 8 weeks in a paper envelope just at room temperature, remove the seeds from the fruit, and then you just bake them at 100 degrees for 3 hours. That simulates fire going through the system, and these guys really like fire for germination in the wild. If you talk to the plant breeders at Kings Park, they'll also recommend that you soak them in smoke water overnight to give you some of the chemical cues for a fire. But skipping that step, I still got about 90% germination success for these guys. So, but the caveat on that is I didn't plant them in soil. I planted them on agar, which is a little bit more nutritious and a little bit easier to grow plants in. And I waited for them to germinate. So this little guy here, he's just sticking out his first root there. I then grew them all up until they were about 1 centimetre tall, harvested them all, mushed them up and took their DNA. I did save some of them to grow in my own garden because I felt really bad that I was killing all of these plants. But what we found was that open plants, so those that are getting visited by birds, have more fathers per fruit. So a fruit doesn't necessarily, all of the seeds within it won't normally come from just one individual pollen donor. They'll have multiple pollen donors present in a single fruit. And that's much higher in open plants. Measures of genetic diversity are also higher in open plants, and likewise the outcrossing rate, which is the proportion that aren't self-pollinated, is much higher in our open plants. So we can say that bird pollination is critical, that because there's high fruit set, high seed set and higher genetic diversity amongst offspring, and that honeybees are ineffective. They don't seem to be completely emasculating the flowers, but they are lowering the genetic diversity and probably fruit and seed production in these systems. And that's a really important point to understand. I haven't said it explicitly, but I've been calling it the European honeybee. It's not a native bee. There's no native pollinating insect visiting these flowers at all. So this is a completely foreign and alien visitor to these plants. European honeybees have been here since the 1800s. They were obviously introduced for agriculture. They're incredibly important for honey production and crop pollination, but there's a good chance that they're probably having a negative impact on some of our native plants in the system. There's studies that have been done that have shown that they reduce seed set in Banksia species and Grevillea species. This is the first time we've seen them foraging intensely on kangaroo paws, and it's reducing fruit and seed set. And while this is just a theory, as I said earlier at the start, bird-pollinated plants are more threatened than other plants in the area. And we know from other studies that honeybees are more likely to visit bird-pollinated plants than they are other plants. So I think that's an area that deserves further explanation, is what impact is this massively introduced species having on all of our plants. And I went through that really fast, I'm very sorry, but are there any questions?